So it's a pleasure that Iain has been willing to share this time with us. And if you like, you can start a brief introduction. Do you want me to show the image?
Yeah, yeah. So can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah.
Cool.
Yes.
That's the book that's coming out next. That's coming out in December, supposedly. Cambridge got hacked, and as a result, all their books got delayed by at least, it looks like at least 6 months. This was originally
Mhm.
July, so, well, 5 months. And I have another book coming out after this with them, and I hope it's not too much delayed. It's called Heidegger on the Danger and the Promise of Technology, or what is called Thinking in the Age of AI. So that's
Mhm.
a little book, but it's in this Heidegger Elements series, and it's re-looking at Heidegger's ontological understanding of technology, its dangers and its promises through the lens of our currently most anxiety-provoking technologies like genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. So because that's such a hot topic, I was hoping that would come out before too long, but um, that I don't know when that'll be. I don't have any dates yet, but this one should be by December. It's bringing together the work on death that I've been doing since last century, really. So there's been a pretty dramatic reorientation, let's say, in transformation in my understanding of what death means. I think I'll come back to that at the end, but I just wanted to share that cover because I got to comb through the free files and pick that. You can see it's called The Diamond Ring and the End of Totality, which is kind of perfect because I'm connecting Heidegger's understanding of death to his giving up on traditional philosophy, traditional metaphysics, as an attempt to provide an ontotheology or a complete, or sometimes people say totalizing understanding of everything. So I'll try and briefly at least explain that connection at the end today. So you can take that down, Alfred. I just wanted to share the latest. It's all right. So Alfred asked me just to mention a couple of my main contributions for those who maybe don't know my work very well or at all, and so I'm happy to do that. And then we'll open it up to questions and discussion, objections, whatever you like. So I'll break it into four topics roughly. Ontotheology first, then technology, which is connected, then art, which is also, they're all connected, and then death. So in 2005, my first book came out that was based on my dissertation research, which I did in California under Bert Dreyfus and Jacques Derrida. They were both my teachers, and Derrida died, and Dreyfus sadly died. Well, both sadly died not that much long after that, but they were both, although they're seen as kind of opposites in the continental world, they were actually both very supportive and um, liked each other fine. So it was interesting for me to see that a lot of the political fault lines in the continental world are exaggerated in at least some cases. So the ontotheology book, basically the central argument was that ontotheology is a kind of a skeleton key to unlocking the comprehensive understanding of the later Heidegger, where the ontotheology thing argues that Heidegger's understanding of metaphysics is actually much more central than most people understand. In the 90s, when I was kind of coming up in philosophy, everybody wanted to be anti-metaphysics. Being it's still to some degree true. Oh, that's metaphysical, or that's metaphysics was an insult. So, but I don't think people really knew what metaphysics meant for Heidegger. They had sort of vague ideas. So my claim is that ontotheology is basically the the core structure of the entire history of metaphysics. So metaphysics for Heidegger isn't just some abstruse concern of philosophers in their ivory tower. It's the history that we are, as he says in The Age of the World picture in 1938. It's, in other words, it shapes the fundamental presuppositions about what is and what matters that we take for granted in everything else we do. So it provides these kind of basic principles of vision and division, as Bourdieu put it, whereby we cut up and make sense of the world, built into the perspective through which we see. I sometimes describe it as like providing the deepest prejudices that shape our comprehensive self-understanding. Levinas, who was a student of Heidegger, talks about mutations in the light of the world. So in the history of the West, Heidegger's history of being, there's basically three big ages. And each of these three ages, it looks like, maybe not the middle one. I'm kind of unsure about that. I'm a public school kid, so I never learned a lot of Christian philosophy. But the medieval period, although Heidegger knew the most about that, is a little murkier to me. But the ancient, the medieval, and the modern, I think the typical view he has is that each age has two epochs. So like the ancient has the pre-Socratic and the Socratic or Platonic and post-Platonic, then the medieval, then the early modern and the late modern. There's probably two medieval ones, but I don't know what to say about that. But each of those ages and within them, the epochs are grounded by an ontotheology. An ontotheology is his formula for it, he often calls it a fundamental metaphysical position. And he defines that as a truth concerning the totality of entities as such. That phrase that he uses 100, 200 times, the truth concerning the totality of entities as such, he uses that when he's pro-metaphysics and when he's anti-metaphysics. So his understanding of what metaphysics is doesn't change after he turns against metaphysics. He's just now, instead of trying to do it, which is what he was still trying to do in Being and Time, he decides it's impossible and decides that philosophy has to become something other than metaphysics. It has to become post-metaphysical philosophy, and that's what he calls thinking. So ontotheology, this understanding concerning the truth about the totality of entities as such, if you hear that phrase, truth concerning the totality of entities as such, it's got at least three parts, right? Truth, totality, and as such. So the metaphysics, when it understands what it means to be, understands it that way. The as such is the onto, and the totality is the theo, is the simplest way to think about this. And the truth, that's aletheia. So truth concerning totality of entities as such means the intelligibility that we live in, the way fish live in water, undergoes three big mutations and then two subtle ones within each of those. Those mutations in the light of the world or in the water through which we swim are most profoundly grounded, focused, and disseminated by metaphysics. So what metaphysics does is it drills down on our understanding of what it means to be, and it gives us the deepest possible grasp of entities in two different ways, two opposed ways. It like drills into reality and looks for the tiniest little parts out of which everything's built. That's the ontological enterprise. We've been doing that since Thales. But Heidegger often says Plato is the first metaphysician because Plato is the first thinker to bring together the onto and the theo, the two different ways of doing this, because I argue that they start in Thales and Anaximander, respectively. So the onto is drilling down to the microscopic, trying to find the one stuff out of which everything else is built. That's fundamental ontology in Being and Time. So Heidegger's still doing the onto of ontotheology in Being and Time, is my view, and turns against it. The theo is the as such, is the totality. That's like the attempt to grasp the whole of what is from the outside in. It's like taking up a God's eye view on the universe and understanding the whole of it. Now, what makes ontotheologies work is that they actually do get as deeply into the core of reality and as far out to this complete totalizing grasp as humans are capable of getting at that point in time. So ontotheologies aren't just legislated by some philosopher's private imagination. They are philosophers pick up on things that are happening outside them in art. That's a big one for Heidegger, but also in science, in various fields. I'll get into that too when we turn to technology, how that happens. But to simplify, an ontotheology is an attempt then, when you put the two together, to grasp and understand the totality of all that is in two very different ways, from the outside in, the theo, and the inside out at the same time. So Heidegger talks about double grounding. Ontotheologies doubly ground and stabilize the intelligible order. For a long time, people thought ontotheology just meant treating God as the highest cause, as like the pinnacle in the chain of being, the highest entity that stops the regress. But that's only part of one way of understanding the theo story. He reads it all the way back to Plato and lots of thinkers who didn't have quite such a, and all the way forward to Nietzsche, who was for him the last metaphysician. Although Pippin's recently brought out this book arguing that that's Hegel. I think that's the biggest confusion in Pippin's new book, is that he's put Hegel in the position that's rightly occupied by Nietzsche for Heidegger. Anyway, okay, so ontotheologies then are these conceptual accounts of what is and what matters, of the onto and the theo, that reach the deepest core and the furthest out perspective and join those together. And by doing that, manage to stabilize humanity's understanding of what it means to be anything at all, long enough for a historical age to take shape and spread. So these epochs, epoche in Greek is hold back. Gets that from Hegel, right? Like I'm from Husserl, the phenomenological epoche, or it's like holding back your normal assumptions and understand and just focusing on consciousness. So that the epochs hold back the overwhelming floodwaters of being long enough for a stable way of understanding what is and what matters to take shape. So once you understand that the history of being is not just some weird, the way Richard Rorty dismissed it to me as like Whig history, just like an account written by the winners of how we got here. And I don't think that's it at all. I think it's an account for Heidegger of the innermost logic of Western history, which increasingly is spreading across the globe in the form of technology, such that the problems that were born out of our way of understanding reality are now everybody's problems. We can talk about that too. But okay, so that's ontotheology. Ontotheologies are an attempt to explain all reality by getting to the innermost core and the outermost perspective and linking those two together in a way that stabilizes the intelligible order. So how's that connected to technology? Well, technology is our late modern understanding of what it means to be. So another way to put the critique of metaphysics is that it reduces being to the being of entities. So when Heidegger said it reduces being to the being of entities, he means another phrase that I like of his for the being of entities is isness. Although that's a crazy word in English, isness. It's like, what's it mean to be anything at all? What's isness? That brings out how weird that question is. So metaphysics is answering the question of what isness itself is. And when you transform humanity's understanding of isness, or what it means to be anything at all, you set off a transformation in everything, because everything's interconnected and everything conceivable, intelligible, let's say, imaginable, encounterable is in some way. So when you change what it means to be, what isness means, you set off a transformation that permeates all things. So that's his view about how metaphysics transforms our understanding of reality, and the one we live in like fish in water. But the current one, the late modern one, is an understanding of the being of entities that he traces back to Nietzsche. So the ontotheology that all of us implicitly buy into, we drink it in with our mother's milk, raised in the society, is that we believe that the being of entities is eternally recurring will to power. And that sounds like a weird thing to say, but when you understand what it means, it's not so weird. So to say that for us, our ontotheology, the ontotheology grounding and unifying our age, is eternally recurring will to power, is to say that we think what it means to be anything at all is to be nothing more than will to power, that is just force striving against force with no goal except the maximum perpetuation of force. And Nietzsche gets that view, as I mentioned briefly earlier, by looking at Darwin. He's thinking of like the lion and the gazelle struggling. It's like life doesn't care who wins the fight between the lion and the gazelle. It just cares that that struggle drives life to get stronger, faster, more adaptive, so that life can stay alive. So life stays alive by expanding, by growing. And that's will to power. And then if you ask, so if that's the engine, that's like the deepest core that unifies all things, what's the big form take? Like, how does reality as a whole unfold? What's it look like from the God's eye view? And that's eternal return. So to say that we understand all reality as eternally recurring will to power means that not that every, like we necessarily understand love that way, though we do when we, use these dating apps and stuff, but that's our default way of making sense of things. So if you ask, what's it mean to be this or that, we basically default to a view that things are made out of forces that are just coming together and breaking apart with no goal beyond the maximum perpetuation of force. And that ontotheology is shaping all the sciences for Heidegger. Like psychology, if you ask a psychologist the philosophical question that Heidegger's been asking since his Husserl days, what's it mean to be? That is, what's it mean to be conscious, right? So psychology, the logos of the psyche, the order and principle of consciousness, the psychologist can't, he thinks, tell us what it means to be conscious. Instead, it takes over that question from the ontotheology that's unifying the age. So for a contemporary psychologist, consciousness is just like a meta-emergent property that comes out of the randomly emergent sensory modalities, sight, vision, hearing, all that, all those when they come together in this new faculty that takes the inputs of all these different sensory abilities together, that's consciousness. So there's no goal, there's no aim other than the maximum perpetuation of force. I'm teaching the what's it called, on Nietzsche's dictum, God is dead essay right now in my later Heidegger seminar. And that's a fascinating one because it's, written in 41 and it's all this stuff is very political for Heidegger. And that's what I was arguing back in the 90s when people were saying none of this is political. Heidegger isn't like the Hannah Arendt line, oh, he burned his fingers on the stove of politics and retreated into the heights of philosophical abstraction. No, I mean, Heidegger was always doing a philosophy that was deeply engaged with politics. We can't pull the two apart neatly that way. So the first book has a whole, the Ontotheology book has a whole account about how Heidegger's philosophy led to his politics and what he learned from his disastrous politics and what we should learn. So to come back to the technology, that's part of it, because I think he first sees the transition from the early modern to the late modern in the Nazis. The early modern, that's Descartes to Kant, that understands all reality as subjects and objects. Descartes turns us all into consciousnesses, right? He shows us that the one thing we can be certain of is our own thought. It exists. We can't doubt the existence of our own thinking. And that turns us into these subjects. Heidegger tells a whole story about how in the Greek world, the subject, the hupokaimenon, was the stuff that underlied out there. It wasn't in the human, it was in the non-human world. It could be human too, but whatever the proper, whatever it is that all the symbebekos, all the properties inhere, and that's the hupokaimenon. And that becomes us because we become, thanks to Descartes, the thing that underlies all awareness. He's already telling that story in Basic Problems of Phenomenology in 28. Anyway, the technology story is that as we turn these technologies, these methods we developed in the early modern age as subjects trying to master and control an objective world, it's like we split ourselves off from the world and then we're always trying to bridge that gap by mastering and controlling. We start turning those technologies developed to control the objective world back on ourselves. So we start objectifying the subject. And that objectification of the subject undoes the subject-object dichotomy that defines early modernity, and that pushes us into the late modern age of enframing, in which we're no longer subjects and objects, we're just part of the resource pool, Bestand, this meaningless stuff on standby to be optimized. So we increasingly treat ourselves as just one more bit of this universe made of force striving against force with no goal other than to maximally perpetuate the existence of force. So it's like a simple way to think of this is that Heidegger is saying Nietzsche's ontotheology of eternally recurring will to power provides like these lenses through which we tacitly see everything. So we implicitly understand everything as meaningless stuff standing by to be optimized, including ourselves. And it's very hard to find things that resist that. So that's our late modern age, and for him, that's the problem of nihilism. Hey, Miles, that's the problem of nihilism because in a world where everything is becoming meaningless stuff to be optimized, nothing really matters. We lose the sense that anything matters. In fact, we transform. He's very good on this in that 41 essay and in the What Are Poets For essay. We transform our attempts to explain what matters to us into value talk. Right now, in the analytic philosophical world, the Das Mon, one of the Das Mons, is normativity. Everybody wants to talk about normativity. For Heidegger, normativity is value talk. It's talking about everything as if there was just better and worse, and that better and worse could be captured in terms of values. But values are, as he says, radical killing, a murdering that kills at the roots. That is, you can't actually do justice to what you care about by talking about it as values, because what you really care about is the invaluable. And the invaluable is not what's worth, it's not what has a higher value than the most valuable thing. It's just what can't be cashed out, what can't be quantified. So we're trying to quantify all qualities, all these inherently meaningful things in our lives, our loves, our commitments. We're trying to turn those into values. And by doing that, we're actually undermining. We're making them into these quantifiable, fungible, interchangeable bits of resource that we can trade and sell and all of this. So that's what I talk about in the technology book. So understanding how Heidegger's understanding of technology is grounded in his understanding of metaphysics, specifically his understanding of ontotheology, such that Enframing is specifically grounded in Nietzsche's ontotheology of eternally recurring will to power. And he expands that ontotheology elsewhere, but I won't get into that unless you want me to. But understanding how Enframing is grounded in this ontotheology lets us see that he's not just pre-associating on the etymology of Gestell, which is what people thought he was doing for a long time, that he's actually got a coherent, interconnected account, a philosophical understanding of these things. So how do we get beyond Enframing? That's once we get the critique that we're trapped in this increasingly nihilistic world where things don't matter to us. It's Umberto Eco's unbearable lightness of being, where nothing really has any weight anymore. We don't really care about things. We can't explain why. We can't explain the things that matter to us, to others, in an intelligible, and coherent way. What do we do? Well, for Heidegger, the solution is art. That is, what's that mean? It doesn't just mean like painting paintings and going into the art market and making a lot of money or not. It means learning from artists, which for Heidegger, the essence of art is poetry. So the most artistic artist is the poet. What's that mean? Well, every poet poetizes their own understanding of poetry, he comes to believe. Like every great poet's poetry contains an understanding of what poetry is. So Rilke has an understanding of what poetry is, and Trockel has an understanding of what poetry is, and Hölderlin has an understanding of what poetry is. Heidegger comes around to loving Hölderlin. Well, he starts there, really, 34. That was Heidegger and Nietzsche's favorite poet. Well, so Hölderlin's understanding of poetry, it's already in Heidegger's 1934 essay on Hölderlin, and the essence of poetry is that poetry is naming into being. Naming into being. What the hell does that mean? He quotes that again in Origin of the Work of Art in 34, 35. It means that what the poet does is they reach into the not yet fully intelligible and they conceptualize it. I talk about human beings as We possess the opposable thumb of thought. That is, we conceptualize, begriff. We wrap our minds around things. Concipiere is the Latin. We are able to break off a piece of things and understand it. So the poet reaches into what's not yet clear, and they clarify it, and they bring it into our world, and they share it. So the essence of poetry for Heidegger is this kind of maieutic or midwife art, where we reach into what's not here yet, and we help deliver it into the world. Now, that's what he comes to understand as Dasein. Dasein is to be a responsive and creative world discloser. That is to bring into the world what's not fully here yet. That's in Being and Time, Dasein is just a description of what we are. For later Heidegger, becoming Dasein is like the key to saving humanity from nihilism. What's that mean? Just become a Being in Time person and you're saved? No. Actually, Being in Time is caught up in the problem, though he's not super clear about that. So we have to move into later Heidegger, for later Heidegger, to really get out of nihilism. It means like to get out of this view that everything's just meaningless stuff waiting to be optimized. We have to learn from artists, specifically poets, to see the world as something beckoning to be responded to and creatively disclosed. And the more we tune into this vision of things as, he calls it, or the first word for it is the nothing of the nothing. That is the way in which what is not yet beckons to be brought into the intelligible world. He then calls that the earth, then being as such. There's no one name for what all names are trying to name. A lot of people thought he just was struggling for a new name for being, and I think that's wrong. I think he's giving us various different ways of tuning into what it is that all intelligibility draws from without being able to exhaust. So the more we learn to do that, the more we learn to be responsive and creative world disclosers, the more meaningful our lives are. And it's that meaningfulness that's the direct antidote to nihilism. All right, I realize I'm going on. I'll say a little bit about death just to connect it to this point. There's a common misunderstanding of Heidegger that conflates Heidegger and Levinas. For Levinas, and Levinas doesn't do this, he's quite clear about the differences. So maybe over exaggerates them. But for Levinas, what matters is alterity, otherness, the ineffable. You know, what we can, he doesn't use ineffable because he has paradoxical formulations for what humanity gets meaning from. But for Heidegger, he talks about this in the dialogues on the Country Path. Ineffability is not a phenomenological notion. You can't have phenomenological evidence of something outside all possible comprehension. If there's some evidence for it, it's not outside all, let's say, intelligibility. So the idea of something that's on the other side of intelligibility is not an intelligible notion. So for Heidegger, being is not some mysterious withdrawing that can never be seen at all. Instead, as he explains most clearly in the origin of the work of art, it's where he talks about it as earth. It's what informs, that is, lends itself partly to our conceptualizations. These poetic grips on the world get pieces of it. We get little pieces of it. We just never get all of it. So it informs, but always overflows our meaningful utterances, practices, etc. Okay, so that's where I see Heidegger going. And death plays this really crucial role that's been deeply misunderstood because everybody, including me, for a long time, 10 years probably, misunderstands death by thinking death means death. Death means what we talk about. And death doesn't mean croaking. It doesn't mean, that's what he calls demise, ableben. Death means it's something you can live through, to put it as paradoxically as possible. And the Death book shows why he thinks that and what that argument's supposed to do in Being in Time. It plays a really crucial role in the text, like 3 crucial roles. It bridges the 2 divisions of the book. I explained it in the intro, which I posted on academia.edu if you want to go look at it. But so death is not croaking. You can't be croaked. There's no phenomenological evidence of being croaked. Like demise, that's demise. So when you croak, there's nothing that it's like to be. as far as we can tell, phenomenologically, from this side of the veil. Maybe there's something on the other side of the veil. Heidegger's agnostic. He's not atheist. He's not theist in being a time. He's being a phenomenologist and sticking to the evidence. And the evidence is we don't know. There's no way to know what happens on the far side of all evidence. You can guess, etc., but you can't know. So if death was only demise, then there would be no experience of what it meant to be dead. Heidegger wants a phenomenological experience of being dead, is a crazy way to put it, but that's what he's after. And that's what happens when your understanding, that is the stand you take on yourself, these practical identities, teacher, student, carpenter, think of his dad in most of those descriptions in Being in Time, when those all break down and you find yourself still here. So death is like the collapse of your intelligible, practical world, the world of your projects, in which you're still here, and but nothing makes sense to you anymore. It's not like it's not that you can't understand a clock as a clock. It still has the forehand or present at hand or the on-hand intelligibility of a clock. It's just you don't care about it. You can't connect to it anyway because being a teacher or a parent or a pet owner, all that's broken down. So there's no reason for you to get out of bed. We can get into that more. But what happens in this experience of total world collapse, where you're kind of a shipwrecked self, he calls it a solus ipse, a self alone, is that you experience, that's where temporality is first encountered. So you experience the sheer coming towards you of the world. That's the Zukunft, the to come. So futurity is the first aspect of temporality that you encounter, and you only encounter it you most primordially encounter it in the experience of existential death, the complete breakdown of your world. Now what do you encounter? You encounter the world in its unorganized form as something that you could connect to in a lot of different ways, but none of which has dominance. That experience in which you're encountering a kind of conceptually overwhelming and practically overwhelming coming towards you of the world, that's the nothing. He calls it the nothing. And it's by 29, that's the nothing of the nothing. By 34, it's the earth, etc. So what we're afraid of about dying, about demising, is, Heidegger thinks, really an encounter with that overwhelming oneness. That oneness, maybe he actually doesn't, he talks about the einfaltige Mannigfaltigkeit, the like one-fold multiplicity. He doesn't want to try and quantify being. You can't count being, right? That's to try and apply quantity to the source of all quality. So it's that we encounter this kind of overwhelming thing that makes us anxious, makes us unable to get it under control. So we're anxious. And poetry is how we learn to be at peace with our anxiety, to tune into the source of what anxiety is anxious about and see it as where the new comes from, where meaningful creations come from, where the future comes from. And I have a big chapter on politics in my understanding of where Heidegger's politics should go in the Death book. And that's to think about how humans as a whole are undergoing a kind of version of the same crisis that we undergo in Being in Time. Like this anxiety about the world that's coming toward us. We at least in the USA, we're experiencing this as a like worry that the world's changing too fast. Things aren't staying put. They're not staying in their places, and there's a kind of regressive move toward a desire for a strong paternal, we call this fascism, a strong patriarchal figure who will like tell us it's all going to be okay. We don't have to worry about the anxiety of freedom. Just follow their rules, and we can fit right in and have a happy, successful life of conformity. So that's inauthenticity, right? The inauthenticity of fascism, basically. All right, my dog's going crazy downstairs, so I'll end there and see what hopefully some of what I said sparked some questions, thoughts in y'all.
Well, thank you very much for your clear and impressive presentation. Anyone who wants to go first?
I certainly have a number of questions, but can limit myself to one.
You can start with one, and then we can always see if you do another one.
Well, thank you again for an extremely illuminating overview. Um, I, I wanted to get some clarification on ontotheology. Um, with the what is the causation between a philosopher of ontotheology like Nietzsche expressing a late modern worldview or Descartes with an early modern view and the manifestation of that implicit view of being in the culture? Is the philosopher sort of the an initial cause that subsequently manifests into society, or is it more of a Hegelian relationship of a philosopher retrospectively articulating different movements going on within the society?
That's a nice way to put it. That's a really great way to put it. So it's neither of those things. It's an attempt to sublate the dichotomy between Kant and Hegel. So it's that I think Heidegger's more Hegelian than Hegel in a lot of ways. Like he actually, anyway, but I won't get into that. I'm probably wrong. A lot of my colleagues are Hegelians. So think of Nietzsche. Nietzsche doesn't make up the idea of will to power. He's getting it from Darwin. He's also getting it from Adam Smith, for whom what it means to be an economic thing is to be caught up in this logic of supply and demand, and you maximize economic growth when you let the forces of supply and demand just struggle with each other. That's free market theocracy of neoliberalism now, right? That, and he gets it from his reading of chemistry. If you read Julian Young's biography on Nietzsche, he's reading chemistry, and he thinks chemistry is showing that the physical matter is made up of these same kind of forces. So he's picking up on it in all these different sciences, all these different Wissenschaften, our understanding, Nietzsche thinks, reality is will to power. He names it as a whole, as Heidegger says in the 41 essay, he generalizes it. He sees it not as just true of living things like Darwin or economic things like Smith or chemical things, but of all things. So it's that generalizing move that makes it the onto of the ontotheology. And how does that then disseminate out into the culture? Well, it plays a role as a kind of like focusing and disseminating it. Like it first puts a name on something that's already happening. So for Heidegger, the philosopher, I said this briefly, but it might have been too fast. The philosopher doesn't like make this stuff up and project it onto the world. They're like a sensitive antenna bug, you know, they pick up on things that are happening independently of them. And like a poet, because the great thinkers are, well, Heidegger's views on the relation between poetry and thinking are great and weird and deep. But they play this Dasein role of responding to and creatively disclosing what's happening outside themselves. And when they successfully name their age's deepest and most encompassing understanding of what it means to be, that plays some role, Heidegger never tries to account for it, in setting off this kind of seismic shock waves that then go out into the culture and slowly, often transform their age. So Heidegger says things when he's trying to, when people ask him like, how long are we going to be caught in this? He'll say like, well, look what Nietzsche says. Looks like 2 centuries at least. So it takes a long time. It's not an instantaneous thing. But when you transform what isness is, it sets off this, it catalyzes, it's the language I use, it catalyzes this transformation in everything. Now, it's not that everything, like if it actually, I've been, an early misunderstanding of my view and Heidegger's view was that like we can't experience reality except as Bestand, as meaningless stuff. If that was true, there'd be no way out. We'd be trapped, I think. So I don't think he's saying that. I think he's saying increasingly we understand everything in its terms. I think Foucault was very Heideggerian, and he's picking up on this when he talks about the vascular to capillary spread of biopower. Biopower is his name for enframing. It's just like it goes from kind of general, you got to follow the rules, to like increasingly specific. Every thought you have has to be checked by your your current Das Monk.
Well, you anticipated the follow-up question I was going to ask. So clarify this if I've misunderstood that you would say that role of philosopher to his society would be parallel to the account of the Greek temple and other world-defining pieces of art in the origin of the work of art.
So I have a whole one of the things I'm proudest of in my work is chapter 3 of Heidegger, Art and Postmodernity. I don't know if you've read that, but that's where I talk about
Yeah.
this, the thing on the sheet. So I mean, Heidegger, the way he puts it in the Hölderlin lectures, which are great, is there's a God. There's gods, plural. He doesn't think we can quantify gods. And that's like ways of understanding what matters, things that matter independently of human will. That's how I understand gods. And then there's the demigods, and that's, Hercules, Dionysus, and Jesus. They're half human, half divine. And what that means to be a demigod is to be going among mortals trying to get recognized in your divinity, trying to get accepted as a new vision of what matters. And then the poets, this is Heidegger's understanding of Hölderlin's understanding. The poets are the ones who are right under the they are demigods in a way. Well, they're right, I'd say right under the demigods. They're intercepting the winks of the gods, like the hints of the gods, Vinca. And then down one level, then that's the thinker. So the thinker is understanding what the poet is telling us about what it means to be. And then they're disseminating that to, and for a while, that's the statesman. That's the 30s stuff, where Heidegger thinks that's Hitler. Heidegger's going to explain Hölderlin to Hitler, and Hitler's then going to explain to the folk, the people. But, it doesn't have to be Hitler. It could be Trump or Harris or whatever. So the thinker plays this mediating role in transmitting a new understanding of what it means to be, not because it's new, but because it's deeper and more encompassing and more meaningful. So does it play the role of, if you look at what I say in that chapter, I talk about how there's kind of, the temple is, most people focus on that, but there's really 3 works of art in that essay. There's the poem, the shoes, and the temple. And most people just talk about the temple. And the temple sets up an understanding of art as a paradigm, a model of, and a model for reality, like the reflection of reality that then reinforces that understanding of reality among the people. And that can happen at least 3 different orders of magnitude. Micro paradigms, that's things thinking, that like wine in the hot tub with your friends, or like a good meal with your family, that reinforce what matters in a kind of local way. Then paradigms, which are like things that transform your very understanding of what it means to be. And then there's macro paradigms like gods. And those are things that transform your historical age's understanding of what it means to be. And a lot of people think Heidegger's got this, including my teachers, thought that Heidegger had this kind of quietistic view where all we can do is wait and prepare for something that might one day happen. The famous "only another God can save us" line is often heard that way. But that's not what that means. That means we need a new understanding of being. That's the other God who can save us. And it's here. It happened already with Hölderlin and Van Gogh. And so my way of putting this is the postmodern, what comes after the late modern understanding of enframing, happened already. And what needs to happen now for that to save humanity, in Heidegger's terms, is for that to spread to everybody and become the new default way of making sense of what it means to be anything at all. He doesn't say much about how that will happen when the Zen monk asks him, "Why don't you go on TV and spread this to millions instead of just to thousands?" He's like, he's not interested in that. So I think there's a sense of humility there, and a sense of like megalomaniacalness at the same time, in a kind of unhappy tension. Alfred can probably talk more about Heidegger's personality and how this manifests, but it's fascinating, I think.
Can I say something?
Yes, you can, if you like.
Great, thanks. So Iain, thanks so much for that talk. It's thoroughly enjoyable. It's nice to be in the company of all of you. And I see sort of you as a kindred spirit in the political space, in sort of commenting on what's going on. And in some way, I think that the current developments throw us into that Heideggerian situation like we've never been thrown before. And I suppose in actually much more extreme ways than in the 30s, where you could say Hitler made this sort of promise of the anxiety-free world that we could not at the time necessarily see what it leads to. You could, I suppose, see from an ethical and a practical point of view that it was bullshit. But you obviously had no historical precedent of where it leads to. It is completely different now, and I think that the guy with the funny hair in the U.S. is taking it to an extreme that gives us a whole new understanding, actually, of what Heidegger was talking about, as far as I'm concerned, because the metaphysics is the epoch is now we are estimating entities purely in commercial terms, and that's really, he sort of takes all of this to an extreme that gives us an opportunity to think that is quite extraordinary in some way, in very weird and very dangerous times, a huge gift that is being given to us as thinkers in dealing with this. And obviously, I mean, I'm busy conceptualizing a popular book on fascism right now from my engagement with Heidegger, and I'm seeing how this whole notion of existential anxiety is being employed with unbelievable success that unhinges every notion of enlightenment in front of our eyes. Any notion that we thought would carry our societies forward is being taken apart. And I mean, firstly, it's a sort of a question of whether we should engage in this, maybe the two of us or anyone who is interested, because I think our time actually calls for a response, and this is a special group of people that would have a certain angle from which to develop that response, whatever we actually even think of a response is. But I wanted to share those thoughts with a question mark. Is how does this land in your thinking, and what could maybe be a pathway to a response that we could formulate and offer?
That's great. So thank you, Dominic. I'm really happy you're here. That's wonderful. Because most people don't pick up on this line of my thought. And I've been much more influential in education circles and sort of applied stuff. But yeah, I think the politics is where the rubber hits the road for so much of this stuff. And people are understandably scared of Heidegger when it comes to politics. But, you know, he lived through it. And if we understand what he went through, I think it helps us understand what we're going through right now in a way that makes it, for me, quite terrifying. So I'm really happy to hear like your optimism the point you're making, which is absolutely true, that we are in a situation that demands even a kind of response, and that response is one that the Heideggerians are uniquely positioned to contribute to. I agree completely. I have a chapter in the Death book on the deconstruction of metaphysics and the post-metaphysical politics of ontological pluralism, which is a mouthful, but it's my attempt to think through this stuff. And there's another chapter in there on Simone de Beauvoir's crisis of adolescence and the ethics of ambiguity, which I now want to connect those two. So I don't do it enough in the book, but there's a direct connection between the Beauvoir thinks that every human being goes through a version of this kind of crisis of fascism, where you have to grow up and learn to think for yourself, and that's anxiety provoking, and it's easier to stay, listen to dad and just do what's right and believe you're making the right answer, and that's not growing up. And in the Enlightenment vision of like learning to think for yourself got, as Heidegger says, captured by a narrow conception of reason as ratio is like what you can measure, quantify in the scales. And as he explains in the 41 essay, like value thinking comes out of this Nietzschean metaphysics, where to value is to think, I've got this, I've secured this piece of property. How do I grow? How do I get the property next door? So always looking, or how do I expand into the stock market? How do I diversify my portfolio? I've got this wife, but she's getting old. How do I upgrade for a younger model? You're always looking at A with an eye to B. And this is Nietzsche, quoting Nietzsche, showing all this. So looking at A with an eye to B demands a fungibility, an interchange. You need a lowest common denominator, something that will allow you to translate B into A. That's number. Number is what we use when we want lowest common denominator. So we quantify everything. So values are quantifying. So you can't quantify quality. When you try and like quantify beauty, you get the idea that like the most beautiful building is the one that costs the most money.
Yeah.
Trump, right? Like the most beautiful building is the tallest one. So Trump is, as you say, the embodiment of Enframing. The idea that the good life is the life with the most money in the bank account. To me, that guy's in a state of like manifest misery, literal misery. The misery the misery is the condition of the miser, right? The miser is the one who like hoards all it's the dragon sitting on the pile of gold and the virgins, but never doing anything, right? It's like you don't enjoy anything. You're just caught up in this desperate, endless process of trying to get more for less, this optimization imperative, which for me is Enframing. So yeah, I think our whole age is going through a version of what Heidegger is describing. And I think we need to be a little bolder in not like the young are kind of, they want to be righteous. They want to be sorry if I'm now showing my age. They want to be like uncontaminated by the right, by fascism, by anything that stinks of the wrong politics. So they're being scared off of the sources that actually inspired all the deepest thinkers that then the people they're reading were inspired by. You know, the Derrida, Coes, and Agambens and all. They're not reading even, they're not reading Heidegger. And often they're allergic to Heidegger, but they're reading people who are kind of giving them watered down Heidegger. The unwatered down Heidegger is the best thing. That's what we need, I think, in order to really kind of move toward a genuinely capable, I don't know if that's the right word, a genuinely meaningful response to our current situation.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, the question is, how do we formulate that response in a way that is publicly accessible? That don't just you and I talk in our funny language, which is a mixture of weird German and even weirder English. But sort of how do you put that into a sort of I don't know, almost like an airport bookshop book that that really sort of puts the finger into the wound, so to speak. I mean, I'm German. I've obviously dealt in all my life with the history of the people that I'm being reminded of, that I belong to wherever I go in the world. In a way, I think that Heidegger is completely misunderstood in his involvement in fascism, because I think that Hitler was such a genius in putting his finger on what actually the issue is, and then being totally disingenuous with his response to it. A totally technological response to actually, at least intuitively, being quite close to these notions of anxiety and guilt and etc. And I suppose if you look at Kamala Harris, she is sort of, in my view, obviously will give us a reprieve from this madness, but in a way, her joy and optimism is not the one that we ultimately are looking for here. I think we're looking for something much more, I don't know, call it profound or Heideggerian for that matter.
I mean, I don't, you know more about the German scene, and we probably think about Hitler slightly differently, but I did write a piece on what Heidegger's National Socialism looks like from America, where I analogize, I don't want to say compare, but analogize Heidegger and Trump and talk about Heidegger's attempt to guide Hitler being like you could see a philosopher thinking this Trump guy's come to power and he has no philosophy, he has no vision. He's a demagogue. He just goes with whatever sticks. I'm going to try and guide him. And my way to guide him is to take the buzzwords that he's using and connect them to thought in a way that will and transform the movement. And I do think that is Heidegger's overarching political strategy. I think Derrida was right about that fact in Of Spirit. And I don't think there's any, as Derrida says, he's not just criticizing that from as like a righteous outsider, but instead saying there's no way to transform a political movement from within without getting your hands dirty in that way. You've got to get involved in it, even as you try to transform it. And doing that means that you're going to be connected to it in some way. Now, that doesn't mean that I think we should all become Trumpians, you know, but it doesn't mean that, although I think, God, I hope Harris wins, and I'm very nervous.
Don't we all?
Yeah, but I think like she comes from Berkeley. She's like my people. She grew up in the with my dad and went to school like where my cousins. So when I hear her talking, I hear like my family. Like a lot of the reactions against her are reactions against a kind of like Californian spirituality that people don't realize it's deep. You know, they hear like Hollywood, and so they hear superficial things instead of recognizing that there is this Northern Californian trend that's actually deeply connected to, that's where like the free speech movement came from. That's, you know, in its most powerful American forms. And that's where like the hippie movement really had its most powerful flourishing in America. So there's not, you know, I think, we'll see. I know Zizek was like, oh, everyone should just vote for Trump because that'll, and I have students who are like, oh, there's no difference between Harris and, but tell that to my Hispanic student whose family's going to get deported if Trump wins. Tell that to my Native American student who's, you know, concerned about the pipeline going through it. So tell that to my trans son who's becoming the enemy of the right now that they can't just gay bash anymore since the Supreme Court made gay marriage legal. They need some new right-wing thing to try and terrify everybody out. So all of that is like distractions away from the real problem. And I agree that's what Hitler was good at too. Instead of recognizing that the problem is this massive wealth inequality, this concentration that happens when you just understand all reality as quantity to be maximized, we need to tune into and spread a sense that that's not where a good life comes from. A good life doesn't come from having a huge bank account. Right? You need enough money to not be starving and tortured and tormented and you know, sick and helpless. But having a lot more than that, psychology has shown, doesn't make you any happier.
And I also recognize that Northern Californian spirituality that I was deeply connected to in my late teens, early 20s, and spent lots of time in Berkeley and San Francisco to soak up everything I could soak up there. And I think that a lot of where Harris is coming from is good stuff if you dig into it. And I think there is a task for us to spell that out in win an election. So I'm not expecting her to give a philosophy lecture. We shall be just so happy if we don't descend into fascism and have to provide shelter for you in Europe here somewhere.
Your issue about popularizing it, and I hope you can figure out how to do it. I'm not good at it. In a way, like I feel philosophy has ruined me for being able to speak simply and clearly in a way that could sell at a bookstore at the airport. So people are, one of my students actually, this guy, my first PhD, Carlos Sanchez, has a book out on like Mexican existentialism and how it contains lessons for life that's getting picked up and like talked about. So he's good at it. a lot of it is just, did you keep your people's voice, or did you get socialized into the academic world to the point where you've lost the ability to turn off your super egoic, oh, now I'm saying questionable things that are going to get criticized, right? We are tuned into what the experts are going to say, and we try and be careful and precise, and that's precisely what makes it really hard to understand what we're saying for the non-expert, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
I'll be in touch.
Great.
Any other comments or questions?
What about you, Alfred?
Oh, you've said so many things that I need to think about them. Your interpretation of ontotheology. Robert has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Thank you, Alfred, for organizing. I really admire your work on death, your interpretation of Heideggerian death. I'm actually currently writing an article taking your notion of existential word collapse and reading William Faulkner's A Fable, so death and dying in that historical novel World War One, and how we can make sense of that within the framework of existential world collapse. So I know you write about it very much, but maybe you could say a word about the relation of existential world collapse, authenticity, and anticipatory resoluteness, because I think it's so powerful how you delineate that, related to death and dying.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for teeing me up. I want to hear more about the Faulkner too. That's great. That's like American literature, so that's really cool you're doing that. The book that I love to teach in this context is On the Road. And anyway, that guy was in New Mexico, and it's got like these prophets of the no God and all this weird stuff in it. But it's this world collapse, like the whole world's collapsed, right? And they're trying to find their way into a new world. So it's fascinating. So if you think of, to come to your question, the relation between death and authenticity, as you suggest, I understand death as the anticipatory of anticipatory resoluteness. So authenticity, vorlaufende, what is it? What's the resolve? Entschlossen.
Entschlossenheit.
Entschlossenheit. So vorlaufende Entschlossenheit. The vorlaufende, the charging out into, running out into, that's death, going into this state of world collapse. And then the Entschlossenheit is the unclosedness, right? Like you then reopening yourself to the world. So I hear authenticity as both. Like it's like dying and being reborn. Your world collapsing and then you reconnecting to the world. Now, in the English translation of Being in Time, I think both of them, but certainly in the Macquarie and Robinson one that I teach every year, probably for the last 30 years, and I'm still learning more from every time. It's such a great book. The authentic gets used to translate eigentlich when it's modifying a lot of other words. And I've got a former MA student who got his PhD on Heidegger at South Florida, John Preston, who's done a lot of work on the roots of that in Aristotle and Heidegger stuff on Aristotle in the 20s, showing that Eigentlichkeit wasn't initially like an ethical ideal. It was a phenomenological ideal of seeing it for yourself, directly connecting to it and understanding it yourself, first personally, encountering it. And I think that's all. So you get people often ask me, what's like authentic resolve mean? Or, because he does use these in the later part of the book. There's some confusing terminology there. But I think the central idea is authenticity only happens when you pass through world collapse and then reconnect to the world. So it's a kind of secularization of the conversion narrative, like Saul dying to being this Christian hunter and being reborn as the proselytizer of the faith. That's the paradigmatic example. The scales falling from his eyes is kind of like seeing the light. The white light is the too much of the nothing. I see this world that I can't organize. after my old world's collapsed and I don't know how to go on. That's the being blinded by light. I connect this in my first book to education and to the parable of the cave, which in Plato is a parable of education. So Heidegger's reading of the parable of the cave is about transforming education so that it's about like getting free from enframing. Like what's it mean to stop just seeing the world as a happy enframer who thinks the point of everything is to get the most for the least. And of course I should use ChatGPT to write my papers. That's more efficient than writing myself, and I'll get a higher grade with less work. That would be irrational not to do that. How do we break out of that and see the world in a new way? So I was already addressing that there, but it's continued throughout my work. And the idea is that we go through this kind of collapse of the world that then allows us to, as he puts it in 34, open ourselves to one of the selves we could be that's coming toward us. So there's a kind of sense of receptivity that gets increasingly emphasized as you go into later Heidegger, like an openness to a future that's arriving. There's always more than one future arriving. This is very obvious at like a time like right now in America. We're on like a kind of an obvious divide, which future's going to arrive, you know. But for Heidegger, I think this happens a lot more than we notice. And it certainly happens in existential death, where you're kind of overwhelmed, anxiety, made super anxious by there's too many futures. I can't be all of them. What can I be? And that letting go of the others to become one in this kind of joyous, anxious joy is the resolve moment. So authenticity is dying to the world and being reborn to the world. I think it requires both. And I'm interested to hear how that plays out in Faulkner.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. In Faulkner, I play around a little bit with the conversion narrative, or so that novel is about World War One, and actually it's like a Jesus Christ story. So Colonel Stephen says, "Put down the arms," and it's like it's about to finish the entire war, but then the masters of war restart the war. So I'm looking at different characters dying and different ways of dying. So I'm taking the priest, for example, and I argue that he already experiences existential world collapse in your sense, and then later on he demises. So his foundation of belief breaks down because he sees that the other one, that this Colonel Stephen, is actually firmly rooted in his belief and way more than he is. And then with this, with this Jesus Christ figure, I would say that actually that demise is not able to actually kill him in that sense. So, that existential world collapse does not happen. And this is, like exactly this kind of conversion.
That's super interesting. Wow. I've
Yeah.
got a bunch of footnotes on that. That was a question Rathal was always pushing me on, like, because I say you're gonna die when you demise. That was back in my Cambridge Companion piece on that.
Yeah.
When you croak, if you're conscious and aware, your world's going to collapse. You're going to realize that you're not going to be able to do any more projects. They're all good. But I'm not so sure about that. Like, I think if you live in this sort of later Heideggerian Gelassenheit way, where you're not an ego and not a subject, and you've seen yourself in your solidarity with other Dasein, where others are going to carry on the projects that give your life meaning, maybe those projects don't have to collapse when you demise. That you can see them, hope at least that they're going to carry on. And I talk about that a bunch. And there's a kind of interesting version of that in Derrida, late Derrida, although he always thought death was demise. And my early piece on Derrida is sort of caught up. I have a piece on death and demise in Derrida and Heidegger or something like that. And Can I Die? It's called. And I think there of death as demise. So it was only when I sort of got disabused of that view by the passages in Being and Time that just don't make sense when you put demise in where it says death, death is something we live through.
I think you write this at some point. I think that's also a great observation, that usually we have this notion, when he dies in his sleep, so when he does not actually realize that he's dying, that's a happy death, but actually maybe not, because then you don't have the existential world collapse, and then you're just demised, or Yeah.
Nice. I expanded that in the book, and I talk about it as like a sign of the cowardice of our culture, and like our anxiety about demise is that we think the good death is the one where your whole world gets stolen and the theft gets stolen. It's like the worst.
Yeah.
The worst, you know, is our good death. Yeah, that's the Tolstoy element.
Yeah.
Thanks. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you so much.
Anyone else has a comment, question?
I could. I've already spoken, so I want to cede that to anyone else who wants to.
Miles, I see you.
We see you
See you, Miles.
with a happy smile.
Hi, Ian. I'm sorry I missed the beginning, and so I'm trying to learn where the discussion is,
Yeah, no,
how the discussion reached this point. So I have to listen a little longer.
okay.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Yeah, we had a big techno glitch at the beginning where we never sent out the link, so everyone had to do it the hard way. So the people here are the resourceful ones.
Yeah. They understand technology.
Yeah. Well, I often have said Heideggerians tend to be technophiles rather than technophobes, but who are reflective about how it's transforming us. We're not just using it and becoming tools of our tools. We're not usually Unabombers trying to live in a cabin in the woods, but we are aware of how that bone in our pocket is transforming our lives, and not entirely happy about it.
Robert wrote a piece on the Unabomber and Heidegger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They interviewed Dreyfus about it because they thought he might know him.
Jonathan, if you like, you can continue.
This will be a much more granular question on where I've just finished my dissertation, so I've been going through dozens, if not hundreds, of articles. And I think one of the points from the Heidegger Art Postmodernity book, and I believe it's chapter 3, that I've seen get a mixed reaction to, and I want to hear your response to that mixed reaction, or if you would rephrase it, or whatever, is with the discussion of the Van Gogh painting, and you argue that there's a common misreading that when Heidegger's describing the life of a peasant woman wearing the boots and trying to make points about art from that. And you point to kind of these impressionistic brush strokes that Van Gogh's making right above the rims of the boots. And at least some of those brush strokes actually look like an old lady with a hunched back on that. And I believe your book says that you think Heidegger was picking up on those kind of Rorschach brushstrokes and using that intimation of this impressionistic painting style for trying to formulate his points about phenomenology and art and intelligibility. But at least I've seen scholars point to that line as, oh, you're going too far, or is it an essential point?
So that's a good way to phrase it. Is it an essential point? It's not essential, but I think if you don't understand it, it's very hard to understand what Heidegger's doing there. So I don't know how many people know what Jonathan's talking about, but let me see if I can. Right there. That's you're describing her hunchback as this. I see that as a shoulder and her arm, like in a cardigan sweater, and that's her little thing on her hair, her nose, her eye, her thing. That's like the potato fires and her little shovel, and she's walking right there. So Mark Rathall added a little, like he outlined it in color for me, being a techno guy. And it's on, I added it to the link to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy piece. So if anyone's like, what the hell's Thomson talking about? And you don't see it, go look at the entry is called Heidegger's Aesthetics, which was the title they gave me. And I start off by rejecting that title, but because Heidegger's against aesthetics for art. But that's where you can see the woman. So if you can see that woman, I call it the little old lady who lived in the shoe, you can't unsee her. It's like once you've gone from seeing duck or rabbit to duck rabbit, you can't go back to seeing it just as duck or rabbit. So I think it's a fascinating moment in the text where, which explains why Heidegger's talking about this farming woman. I don't think he's free associating to just farming women, because if he did, then Shapiro's critique that the Dutch farming women that Van Gogh painted, who are farming in muddy potato fields, wouldn't wear leather boots to farm because that would crack and destroy the boots too fast. They don't make enough money to buy new boots every couple months. They farmed in those wooden clogs. So why would you paint? Why would Heidegger see farming woman farming in the leather shoes? And that objection, which was seen in the art world as being utterly devastating to Heidegger's reading, and as evidence of his Nazi unconscious projections. They thought he was projecting this earth and soil associations onto Van Gogh's painting. I'm contesting all that and trying to suggest that instead, what's happening there is Heidegger sees Van Gogh's painting as a painting of aletheia. Aletheia is just earth world. So the earth is the lethe and the world is the alpha privative, the un. So the tension that is truth, this aletheic tension that is the intelligible world, is a struggle between what overflows a world and withdraws from that world and what the world manages to preserve and stabilize. So in the world of the farmer, the farming woman plants this stuff in the earth, she nurtures it, she brings it forth. For Heidegger, the farmer is always like a figure of, it's a kind of paradigmatic figure of poetry, which just also explains that horrifying line about the death camps being essentially the same as mechanized agribusiness. The reason he's saying that is because he sees the death camps as this ultimate version of enframing. They turn even humans into Bestand, resources to be optimized. But mechanized agribusiness is similarly effacing the earth. It's like destroying our relationship to something that stands independent of our will, stands as well, that informs our will. So the earth world tension, I describe it in there as like, we describe this, commonly people call this painting a still life, like a still life. There's nothing still about this for Heidegger. It's like a bound frenzy, is his word. It's Odysseus bound to the mast, right? So there's like an explosion of earth in that painting that's only partly stabilized by world. So this background here, that's the nothing. He says like, there's nothing to which these shoes can belong. For years, I think before me, everyone just read that as, oh, you can't tell where the shoes are. No, that's the nothing, the not yet a thing that they're stepping out from. So the earth as the not yet a thing is lending itself to being partly captured as shoes. So that's the main thing we see when we see this painting, right? Shoes. And he even starts off every time he talks about it's a representation of shoes, all this. But then he ends up talking about this farming woman. And I think what's so fascinating about that is even in this world of the shoes, there's other worlds. Earth can't be captured in a single world. That's the postmodern. So there's like this inchoate, not fully formalized in Heidegger's self-understanding vision of the emergence of plural reality, of like being as something that informs and exceeds every world, every meaningful world. So you get the world of the shoes, the world of this farming woman right here. That's at least two worlds. And like I talk about the Saints from a Window, the Paul Klee painting where it's just faces, right? And there's no dominant face. It's all these, that's Heidegger loves that because there's not even like shoes. It's just all these suggestive gestalts without a single one. That's more obviously postmodern. So I think it's, I tell the story, I reconstruct the argument of the text in a way where to see what he's doing with it, I think it does help to see the woman, but you can do it without it if you want, if you want to, which most people do. But I think the people who do are the ones who don't see the woman, usually. I don't know if...
you can see it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think once you see that, that's Mark's... it helps to have the real thing, too. Let me see. The potato fires in the background. So, yeah, I can't do it here. But her nose on that drawing is pointing toward the shovel, I guess, which has the fires burning behind it. And I think it's fascinating because if I'm right, then that means Derrida's stuff in Truth in Painting, where he wants to say we'll never know which painting Van Gogh was talking about, which Van Gogh painting Heidegger was talking about, is wrong. It's that one. You know, there's because he never specifies which of the Van Gogh paintings he's talking about. And Shapiro accuses him of just melding a bunch of them together in his mind.
Well, you should remember that Heidegger was in Amsterdam in 1932. And Amsterdam at that time was the first exhibition of Van Gogh's paintings ever. He came a little late, so the official exhibition had closed, but you could still visit and see most of Van Gogh's paintings because they all belonged to his brother, basically. And that led ultimately to the creation of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam.
And for a long time, this was the first painting you saw when you went in the museum, or one of the first. And now I think it's back in the Bestand. They've put it back in the warehouse, not on display, according to my students who've been there recently.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly. But it's always been a kind of a popular work among a few. It's not Starry Night, but maybe it's even better. I thought you were going to ask me about the poem because that one's met with some pushback too. But I think I was the first or one of the two first people saying the poem's really important too. Yeah. So it's funny that it's an essay on the work of art and everybody talked about the temple, but not the painting and not the poem. Still don't usually talk about the poem, but there's been some discussion of the painting for years, mainly because of Shapiro's critique.
You also find some of it on it in his letters to his wife.
Oh, yeah? What did he say there?
He mentioned especially the famous one was the crows over the cornfield and the country path that goes through it with the yellow of the grass that jumps out at you.
Nice. There's the conversations on the country path of Veldweggespräche that he talks about is it the third one, the last one, the tower?
Second one.
Yeah, the tower, the
tower warden and the...
Yeah, I think the tower warden is Hölderlin, and he's explaining the experience he had of the Van Gogh to him. He said, "Oh, I saw the most miraculous picture yesterday."
Yeah.
So for me, I haven't written about that. That's my little skeleton key for understanding that really wild, unfinished dialogue. How would I explain my Hölderlinian interpretation of Van Gogh to Van Gogh? What do I learn? And then the one on the prisoners of war is fascinating too, from a biographical perspective, because his sons are both in prisoner of war camps.
Yeah.
This young man consoling an older man by communicating an experience of being to him in a prisoner of war camp.
I'm doing that one in
nice.
November.
Right. And there's also a famous line from Sartre, Jean-Paul, where he says he's in German prisoner of war camp, but he says, I'm reading Heidegger and I've never felt more free.
Okay, I think we can wrap it up for this evening, and we can have a chat together and see if we can reschedule another one, maybe in early 25.
Can circulate the YouTube link for anybody who
Yeah, well,
do it the Enframing way.
we got
So
it.
I'd love to get more questions, and it's
Yeah.
always fun for me to hear, what people are struggling with or critical of, or or creatively appropriating for their own work. I love
Yeah.
hearing that.